Good afternoon. Actually, my more relevant and my more important title today is Professor of History rather than Dean, and is a quite long-standing member of the Department of History going back to 1973. This is an annual lecture that the History Department, in this case, is co-sponsoring to honor W. Augustus Lowe, who is the founding member of our Department of History. Gus was an historian of the American South and also of African Americans. So it's been our practice to invite a distinguished scholar of either Southern or African American history to deliver the Lowe Lecture. And today we have such a distinguished scholar, Professor Bruce Levine. First, however, I want to say something about Gus Lowe, a remarkable and a wonderful man. He said to me once, as one of my colleagues reminded me a few minutes ago, he said to me once, tapping on my knee, remember, he said, remember that history is really stories. Stories. I don't know that I've adequately remembered or practiced that in my own scholarship, but what I do want to do, at least briefly today, is to keep Gus's story alive. He was born on the eve of World War I into an African-American sharecropper family in the Mississippi Delta. The Mississippi Delta, in this case, is not the Mississippi River Delta that was in South Louisiana, built up by the accumulation of sediment from the Mississippi River on its way down to the Gulf, but rather the floodplain in northwest Mississippi between the Yazoo River and Mississippi River, or geographically between just south of Memphis, Tennessee, down to Vicksburg, Mississippi. It was called in an illuminating book by James Cobb, the most southern place on earth. The most southern place on earth, not least because of its patterns of white supremacy, of black oppression, of black poverty. The blues, or at least what many of us take to be the iconic blues, the Delta blues, come from Mississippi and the Delta. Bluesmen like Muddy Waters, Son House, Robert Johnson, and others. And Gus was born into this area on the eve of World War I, into a sharecropper family. In 1927, he was sent to St. Louis to live with his aunt following the catastrophic Mississippi River flood of 1927. Another citation I give you is John Barry's book, Rising Tide, about that catastrophic flood. One of the most cataclysmic events of that flood was the crevasse at Mound's Landing. A crevasse was a breach in the levee, and through that crevasse came a wall of water, 3/4 of a mile wide, 100 to 130 feet high, that inundated the Delta. An area of 50 by 100 miles was put up to 20 feet of water, 1 million acres under 10 feet of water. And Greenville, and what Gus called their little dirt farm, was deeply underwater as a result of the flood. He went north then after that, and stayed north, because it was plain that if there were to be opportunity in education for a young black man, it was to be in St. Louis and not in the Mississippi Delta. He graduated magna cum laude from Lincoln University in St. Louis in 1937. He earned his PhD at the University of Iowa in 1941, at a time when few African Americans indeed were earning doctorates at predominantly white campuses. He served in the Army during World War II, and then after the war he went to Maryland State College, which is now UMES, until 1966, when he became the founding member of the history department here. He was an expert especially on Southern history, as I said, though he also edited the Journal of Negro History from 1970 to 1974, indeed keeping it alive almost by dint of his own efforts. And he was the co-editor, the principal editor, of the first modern encyclopedia of black history in 1981. Another way in which Gus changed the color line was when an article based upon his dissertation was submitted to Virginia Magazine of History and Biography. And the editor and the publications committee thought it was an excellent piece deserving of publication, But they had to consult with the executive committee because, after all, as they said, Professor Lowe is a Negro, and it wasn't plain that the magazine ought to publish the piece. To its credit, the committee members did accept the essay, and in that way too, Gus, in his own quite quiet but quite effective way, helped to break a color line. He was a wonderful colleague. He was a story teacher. He used to be recognizable on campus by bouncing through the campus with his baseball hat on and the ponytail flowing out the back of it. The history department continues to use that baseball cap for its various formal votes when important votes need to be taken. And I'd also seized this opportunity on a personal note, a story about Gus and me. Since I was also born in Mississippi, not 100 miles away from where Gus was born, but an enormous distance in time and experience and circumstance. I was born in the era of World War II, he of World War I. I was born in north central Mississippi in the hill country, nearer to Elvis, where Gus was born in the Delta, near the Muddy Waters. I came from an academic family, he came from a sharecropper family. I left after only a few months. He stayed there considerably longer. But Gus bridged the gulfs, whether in time or experience or race, in fundamental ways. He was an important person to me, as he was to all of us in the early years of the department, not least for his abiding assistance that we were family, and we ought to treat each other as family and conduct ourselves in that way. He retired in 1984. He died in 1988. We've been honoring him now for more than 2 decades with the Lowe Lecture. But today we're honored to have Professor Bruce Levine join us to help us honor Gus and Gus's memory. Professor Levine is James Randall Professor of History at the University of Illinois-Champaign, Urbana, and a distinguished scholar of the Civil War era. His own research and publications focus especially on how economic change, class and class structure, and a variety of cultural attributes interacted to shape fundamental aspects of the Civil War era. He's author of 3 books and is now at work on a 4th book to be entitled The Fall of the House of Dixie, the Confederacy's Defeat and Slavery's Destruction. Today, however, his talk will come from his 3rd book, Confederate Emancipation, Southern Plans to Free and Arm Slaves During the Civil War, published by Oxford in 2005. It's my pleasure then to welcome Professor Levine.
Thank you, Dean Jeffries, Professor Jeffries, and Dr. Bowling. It's really a great honor and a great pleasure to be invited to give a lecture named after an individual as distinguished and important as Gus Lowe. And for that, I'd like to thank not only the individuals I just mentioned, but also Professor Christy Lindenmeyer, Faye Adams, the UMBC Department of History, the Humanities Forum, the Social Sciences Forum as well. I guess I'm not mic'd. On a day in July in 1861, following the First Battle of Bull Run, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was exulting over the victory that the Confederacy had achieved there. And Davis was calling it a sign of the sure ultimate triumph of the Confederate cause. But one of his brigade commanders, Richard S. Ewell, shook his head in dissent. The South, General Ewell cautioned his president, was only, he said, at the beginning of a long and at best doubtful struggle. But, Ewell added, there was one measure that would secure Southern victory. And when Davis asked him what that might be, Ewell replied, quote, emancipating the slaves and arming them, end quote. In the months and the years that followed this little exchange, the same suggestion that Ewell made, that the Confederacy itself should offer its slaves freedom in exchange for service as armed soldiers, arose repeatedly. And on reflection, that shouldn't surprise us, I think. It addressed that suggestion, addressed one of the Confederacy's chief and most obvious problems in this war, the numerical superiority of the foe. Everyone knew, after all, that the Union contained approximately 3 times as many military-age white men as did the Confederacy. But as everyone also knew, the Confederacy contained 3.5 million slaves, who made up almost 40% of the total Confederate population. And so, as another Confederate general subsequently asked about the Confederacy's black population, quote, "Cannot they afford their quota of soldiers?" End quote. I first came across this subject many years ago while still a student in college. And many years later, when I first began teaching the history of the Civil War, I became transfixed by this subject. And when I eventually began to write a book about Confederate emancipation, I came to see, or at least came to conclude, that there were basically 2 answers that I needed to come up with, 2 answers to at least 2 questions. Questions that were intimately related to one another, but that were also, paradoxically maybe, almost completely opposite in their thrust. The first question was this: how could a government whose armies were so clearly and dangerously outnumbered by its enemy nonetheless refuse, and refuse consistently and adamantly, and until it was much too late to matter, refuse to try to tap this enormous potential pool of military manpower? And the second question was the following: how could a regime brought into being precisely to ensure the survival of slavery ever seriously contemplate trying to survive through methods that would so directly undermine slavery? Today, there's time to say just a little bit about the second of these 2 questions and the answers that my research pointed to. Confederate officials began to hear on this subject early in the war from some individuals in the Deep South, where slaves made up the highest proportion of the total population, such as the region where Gus Low and Professor Jeffries were born. And the idea arose more insistently over time. But the first fully argued Confederate proposal to arm and free slaves came from the pen of Major General Patrick Cleburne, an extremely energetic, very courageous, cool-headed, highly regarded division commander in the Army of Tennessee, the second largest, second most important army in the Confederacy. Fought in the so-called Western Theater of War between the Appalachian Mountain Range and the Mississippi River. And during December 1863, following his army's really ignominious defeat outside Chattanooga, Tennessee, Cleburne penned a very lengthy memorandum, almost a legal brief. He had been an attorney in civilian life. A memorandum that called on the Confederacy to, in his words, immediately commence training a large reserve of the most courageous of our slaves, training them as soldiers. And, again his words, guarantee freedom within a reasonable time to every slave in the South who shall remain true to the Confederacy in this war. The only alternative to doing this, said Cleburne in that same memo, was certain defeat. Defeat both because of the greater numbers available to the Union from the start, but also defeat because the Union was by then drawing even more strength than it began with from the South's own slave quarters in the form of allies, laborers, and fully fledged Union soldiers, approximately 200,000 of those by the end of the Civil War. As Claiborne put it in his memo, quote, "Slavery, from being one of our chief sources of strength at the commencement of the war, has now become, in a military point of view, one of our chief sources of weakness. All along the lines, slavery is comparatively useless to us for labor," he wrote, "but of great and increasing worth to the enemy for information. It is an omnipresent spy system, pointing out our valuable men to the enemy, revealing our positions, our purposes, our resources." And he went on in this really remarkable piece of writing from a major, that is to say, significant general in the Confederate service. "When Union forces entered plantation districts, the slaves became," again his words, "recruits awaiting the enemy with open arms. And those who donned Union blue had proved able to face and fight bravely against their former masters." He didn't say, but he could well have added, that this was never supposed to have been possible, that slaves were supposed to have been content with their lot, and they were certainly not supposed to be capable of fighting effectively as soldiers. Pro-slavery ideology denied both possibilities. "The only way to put an end to these dangers," says Patrick Claiborne in this memo, "was to compete with the Union for the black population's loyalty by matching the Union's offer of freedom." Claiborne then circulated this memorandum among the other general officers in his division and received a great deal of support from them. And encouraged by that support, he then submitted the memo to the Army's newly appointed commander, Joseph Johnston. Johnston then gave Claiborne the chance to present his views at a meeting of all of the Army's senior officers in the headquarters that Johnston had set up in the northwestern Georgia town of Dalton. And so Claiborne did. On the evening of January 2nd, 1864, by a few minutes after 7 p.m. that evening, nearly a dozen of the Army's general officers had gathered in Johnston's headquarters. And after brief preliminaries, Patrick Claiborne began to read his memo aloud and continued doing so for more than half an hour. When he finished, his old friend and pre-war law partner, General Thomas Hindman, expressed his own agreement with Claiborne's views. But that was the last encouraging word that Claiborne heard that night. Major Calhoun Benham, Claiborne's chief of staff, who had seen a copy of Claiborne's memo ahead of time, had also prepared a formal rebuttal, which he then presented. And when Benham was done, 3 other generals got up and vociferously attacked Claiborne's proposal with a great deal of heat. One of them then forwarded Claiborne's memorandum to Richmond, the Confederate capital, in the middle of January of 1864. And so Jefferson Davis received a copy of this really remarkable piece of work. And Davis read it, and then he brought it before his cabinet. And nearly everyone in the cabinet agreed with Davis that this could not be done, and indeed, the conversation about it could not even be countenanced. And Davis promptly sent word to Joseph Johnston in Georgia to suppress the memo and to suppress all discussion of the memo in the Army of Tennessee. And yet, in less than a year, in November of 1864, the further deterioration of the Confederacy's military situation led Jefferson Davis to reverse himself, and now to propose that the Confederacy offer slaves freedom in exchange for military service. And Secretary of State Judah Benjamin publicly championed the proposal in Richmond, and then Robert E. Lee strongly endorsed it as well. This dramatic about-face by the Richmond government and its leading general, who was as close as you could come to sainthood already within the Confederacy by the beginning of 1865, all of this ignited a firestorm of public protest, especially within the slaveholding elite of the South. And much of the protest, much of the content of the protest, boiled down to a very simple, blunt question attributed to R.M.T. Hunter, a leading secessionist in pre-war Virginia, and by this point, the president pro tempore of the Confederate Senate. The question attributed to Hunter was just this: what did we go to war for, if not to protect our property? I eventually found what I think is the answer to this utterly logical question in the words uttered and in the actions done by Confederate leaders themselves. Patrick Cleburne and eventually Jefferson Davis and Judah P. Benjamin, Robert E. Lee, and others had decided that to prevent military defeat and, in consequence, the wholesale destruction of traditional, which is to say, slave-based society, they would have to deprive the Union of thousands of potential black soldiers and place them instead in the ranks of the Confederate infantry. But given both the starkly displayed desire by slaves for freedom and the Union emancipation policy already in place, only a Confederate promise of freedom could conceivably, they concluded, induce slaves to risk death on the behalf of the Southern government. Their critics protested that this kind of policy was obviously incompatible with pre-war Southern society, the society that the Confederacy was now fighting to preserve, to which Davis and Benjamin and Lee replied, I pause for dramatic effect, that this was a view of the war's purpose that had simply now become outdated by events. Much of pre-war Southern society, they said, is already starkly, irrevocably lost, including slavery as we have previously known it. And the only practical question now is how to salvage and maybe regenerate somewhat what remains of that society. As Davis's closest newspaper ally, the Richmond Enquirer, argued, the only practical choice facing the Confederacy now was between, on the one hand, its words, submission and emancipation complete, oppressive, ruinous, and on the other, independence, national independence, with slavery complete, if possible, or as much of it as may be, end quote. And it went on, even if all of the South's slaves had to be freed in order to preserve the Confederacy, it was still worth the price. Because even in that case, Southern whites would still retain not only their own personal freedom, assuming the victory of the Confederacy, but all the rest of their considerable property as well. And still more important, the Southern elite would retain its political supremacy, its control of the state power, and thereby its power to dictate the specific terms of black freedom in a way that would serve its own needs. Just how might a Confederate type of emancipation differ from a Union-imposed version, I think, is the next logical question, and it is a question to which we, thankfully, have answers. In fact, one answer was given by a member of the professoriate, a college professor by the name of Frederick A. Porcher, who taught at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. He wrote a long letter on this subject in December of 1864 to his old friend, who happened now to be the Confederate Secretary of State. If you go to the right schools, you mix with the right people, you have enormous influence, as we all know. Porcher, Professor Porcher, I should say, was an ardent and much published defender of slavery, devotee of slavery. But he was also realist enough to read the wartime writing on the wall. And he therefore warned Secretary Judah Benjamin that unless the government promptly armed and freed a large number of slaves, quote, we shall find ourselves controlled by the inferior race instead of being their masters. Moreover, Porcher went on, if we do take this step, we shall happily discover that the right kind of plan of emancipation will enable us still to, quote, keep our Negroes under our control, end quote. And such a plan would do that by permitting Southern white men to design and supervise the change from slavery to freedom. In the process, those men could specify, his words, quote, the conditions on which freedom shall be granted. And even more specifically, to make statutes for the regulation of labor, end quote, by which, of course, he meant black labor. Well, we not only have that letter, turns out we have the reply that Secretary of State Benjamin sent to his old friend. And in that reply, Benjamin expressed his wholehearted agreement with Porcher. Benjamin confided, in fact, that in proposing manumissions, the Richmond government was looking forward to neither interracial democracy nor the end of plantation society. On the contrary, Benjamin wrote, ultimate emancipation would come to Southern blacks only after they had passed through what Benjamin called an intermediate state of serfage or peonage, of unspecified length, by the way. And so, Benjamin continued, quote, while vindicating our faith in the doctrine that the Negro is an inferior race and unfitted for social or political equality with the white man, end quote, the Confederacy, he said, could still, quote, modify and ameliorate the existing condition of that inferior race by affording it legal protection for the marital and parental relations, and by providing for it certain rights of property and a certain degree of personal liberty, end quote. But no more than that. And these words, I think, help us understand what Benjamin himself had meant when he told a large public meeting in Richmond in early February that these measures that the government had in mind would, quote, yield what we believe to be the best system on earth under protest and take the next best system which could be obtained, end quote. Jefferson Davis got a chance to ruminate even more fully over these ideas when he looked over a letter that he received a few months later. This letter came from an author by the name of Dr. John Henry Stringfellow of Virginia. And Stringfellow was a man of a considerable reputation of his own by this point, and an individual that was certainly no doubter of slavery's value or legitimacy. Quite the contrary, during the mid-1850s, John Henry Stringfellow had been a central leader of the pro-slavery forces during Bleeding Kansas, during the conflict over the future of slavery in the Kansas territory. And this is a man who wore many hats. He was the head of the pro-slavery militia. He was the speaker of the pro-slavery House of Representatives in the territory and the editor of the pro-slavery newspaper, an energetic defender of the cause of slavery. By February of 1865, Stringfellow had finished a stint or two in the Confederate Army and was by then living on a farm in the town of Glen Allen, near the Confederate capital. And it was from there that he sent Davis a letter that was a kind of think piece, I think we'd call it today, a letter suggesting the way in which Confederate leaders ought to think about the subject of enlisting black troops and the future of the South in light of that decision. Stringfellow began by making clear where he stood on the general rights and wrongs of things, specifically reiterating his own firm belief in slavery's moral legitimacy and practical utility. But, said Stringfellow, the South is losing the war. It needs more troops. And the more troops were only to be had by offering slaves their freedom in exchange for military service. Stringfellow hastened to add that if it were done properly, however, abolishing slavery need not mean abolishing the whole plantation system. On the contrary, he said, only the measures involved in so-called Confederate emancipation could save the plantation system. The key for Stringfellow, just as it was for others on his side of this debate, was who was going to do the emancipating, and therefore what kind of emancipation it would be. If we emancipate, he says to Davis, our independence is secured. The white man only will have any and all political rights and will retain all his real and personal property, except for his slaves. And he alone, the white man, will be in a position to make laws to control the free Negro, whose wages, more specifically, would be regulated by law hereafter as may suit the change of relation. In this kind of post-war South, Stringfellow argued, the landless freedman would have to, quote, labor for the landowner on terms about as economical as though he were still owned by him, end quote. Well, this is pretty frank, and this is pretty thorough. And in case anybody was missing what Stringfellow was driving at, he then said these things 3 times in sequence to drive the point home, then suggested Davis might want to circulate this among his Confederates, or his Confederates, in order to clarify the stakes involved and the opportunities presented by this proposal, which Davis did indeed do. This was, as I said, a frank and remarkable document. It ranked with Patrick Cleburne's in those respects, and in its treatment of what it meant for the South's economy, social structure, and, quote, race relations. It was, in fact, without peer in this discussion, but it was not unique in content. John Henry Stringfellow had formulated the matter with exceptional clarity, but he was not the only one thinking along these lines, as he himself surmised and said in his letter. My guess is, these are not his words, but my rendering of his words, I think you know this already, and for good and sufficient reasons haven't said this in public. But in case not, here's how you should be thinking about it. Indeed, others had thought along similar lines. Robert E. Lee had made many of the same points, in fact, more tersely a month earlier in a letter that he sent to a member of the Virginia legislature in January of 1865. The question facing the Confederacy, Lee explained in this letter, was whether slavery shall be extinguished by our enemies and the slaves used against us, or whether we shall use them ourselves, even at the risk of the effects which may be produced upon our social institutions. The South's social institutions, which is always code for slavery, the South's social institutions would be damaged by the change, Lee acknowledged. But then the war itself was already damaging this social institution. An ultimate Union victory would certainly, said Lee, quote, destroy slavery in a manner most pernicious to the welfare of our people. In contrast, Lee goes on, whatever may be the effect of our employing Negro troops, it cannot be as mischievous as allowing the Union to do that, because even if the Confederacy's use of black troops ends in subverting slavery, at least, again his words, that will be accomplished by ourselves, and we can devise the means of alleviating the evil consequences. In fact, Lee was, in January '65, not the first person to put this set of ideas down on paper. Patrick Cleburne had said so in his memo at the end of 1863. It is said, he wrote, slaves will not work after they are freed, but we think necessity and wise legislation will compel them to labor for a living. And afterwards, Cleburne enlarged on that point in a conversation he held in Atlanta with a Confederate congressman. Cleburne told that congressman that he, Cleburne, quote, considered slavery at an end, quote. But as Cleburne saw it, recognizing slavery's demise was only the beginning, not the end of wisdom. If the Yankees succeed in abolishing slavery, Claiborne reasoned, equality and racial amalgamation will finally take place. But if we take this step now, we can mold the relations for all time to come between the white and colored races, and in that case, we can control the Negroes. And they will still be our laborers as much as they now are. And to all intents and purposes, will be our servants at less cost even than now, end quote. Davis, Benjamin, Lee, Stringfellow, and others would enlarge and elaborate on all this later on, but not very much. In aggregate, what Claiborne was arguing, and what others would as well, was pretty much the same, and indicated how, from its own standpoint, a far-sighted section of the Southern elite was responding to a powerful external assault and the resistance and active rebellion of the slave population within. Governments in Richmond and the various Confederate state capitals, it believed, would shape an emancipation process that best fit their needs in return for allowing them to win the war. Their needs being to maintain control of the black labor force, both by monopolizing the land and by enforcing a restructured form of the legalized physical coercion that Southern masters had always considered essential to the survival of their plantation system. The Confederacy never successfully implemented this plan during the war, and the explanation for that is another story that I try to tell in this book. But in later years, after the defeat of Reconstruction, the Southern white elite did set out to reimpose labor control, social inferiority, and political impotence upon a technically no longer enslaved African American population, and in the process put into practice some of the principal tenets that had shaped the Confederate emancipation plans of 1863, 64, and 65, which fact, I think, points to the larger meaning and significance as well as the longer-term impact of all the foregoing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sure, Dr. Levine is open to questions, comments.
Yes, I was struck by a certain similarity in the emancipation of serfs. Of course, in Russia at pretty much the same time, 1863, in that formally it was an emancipation of serfs, but of course they were still in many ways, as before, tied to the land. The Mir system, again, looked democratic, but it wasn't. I don't know the background discussions that went into that, but the pragmatism of these politicians, military leaders, is just striking.
Couldn't agree more. I started off as a student of European history, and so was familiar with precisely the Russian experience, and for that matter, a few decades earlier, what took place in the eastern sections of Germany, right? And for that matter, in another form, what took place in Meiji Japan, the attempt to give up certain things in order to strengthen the state and hold on to the privileges of the traditional elite. Indeed, in 1789, a section of the French aristocracy, with the thunder of peasant revolts in the background, felt itself driven also to make all sorts of concessions, hoping not to lose everything. And I think that's what we're looking at, the American version, or rather the slave owner version of this idea that we've come to know as revolution from above. What this case, and I think all the others remind us, is they're always stimulated by threats, either from without or from below or from both quarters, making it impossible to do what the traditional elite would like to do, which is not change anything one iota. They're driven to this by the fact that it has become untenable for some reason, as the examples you raise so clearly demonstrates. Yes, ma'am.
Do we know anything about the the flip side of the story? That is to say, is there any evidence that the slaves would have been willing to fight for the South if the emancipation had been offered?
Really good question. There's some evidence to think that had this offer been made very early in the war, some substantial number of Southern black people might very well have responded. There's tremendous, we had Northern free blacks were hearing, and not only they, from the South, directly and indirectly, of the bitterness that enslaved Southern blacks were feeling by the initial Northern refusal, not only to emancipate them, but even to allow slaves to escape to Union fortresses to seek their freedom. The laws on the books, or at least the orders coming out of Washington, was return them to their owners. And indeed they did. That happened on a number of occasions. Often enough so that there was enough anger so that some slaves were saying, we will give our support to whoever offers us the best deal. Much as Southern and Northern slaves had decided during the American Revolution when the British and the colonial forces had to compete for their loyalty. So had this been done early, there might have been a response. Of course, it couldn't have been done early because the South wasn't going to do this, as is told in this other story in my book, until the very last extremity because of their own, I think, class psychology. But in any case, they move so late that by the time they move, it's clear to the slave population, and it's, of course, it's now a considerable amount of time after the Emancipation Proclamation on the part of the Union, who's fighting for what, where their best interests lie, and also who's winning the war. And the slaves say, not only to Union officers, as the Union officers move into Southern territory, they say to Confederate leaders who talk to them, why in the world would we join your army? Not only are you offering us this only because they are, but you're losing. And there's probably apocryphal story at this time that captures it, where supposedly a slave who is being considered for service under the terms of this new provision is being encouraged by a physician to get involved. And he says, the physician says, surely you know that if you get involved in this war and win, you'll be free. And the slave supposedly says, yes, sir, I do understand that, but I also understand that if I don't get involved and you lose, we'll all be free. And apocryphal or not, it certainly captures, we have enough evidence to believe, a sentiment widespread enough and spread through the slave grapevine telegraph, as it is known in that era, so that there's a grand total, despite an enormous drumbeat of support and mobilization, of about 40 to 60 black people who are placed in uniform instead of the thousands and thousands that are predicted by the Confederate government in this era. One of these volunteers stays long enough to take a bunch of uniforms and skip town with the presuming intention of selling them. So they're also kept under very close military supervision. They're kept in a prison. Their presiding officers are people who had been prison wardens and so forth. They're fed on the grounds of a prison. So it's pretty clear that the Confederate leadership doesn't have very much confidence in their loyalty either. Yes, sir.
Why 1865? Like beginning of 1865. I mean, most of the cards had been played in just a waiting game. The entire Western theater was under control of the Union. Georgia had been taken. So the Confederacy at that point consisted of part of Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. So even if they had implemented it and slaves had been willing, there simply wouldn't have been enough to do it, or am I missing something?
No, I don't think you're missing something, although we need to remember that Union armies rarely remain occupation forces over large sections of land. So the maps that show Union control and Confederate control are somewhat misleading because they imply that large occupation forces had been left behind when Union forces move ahead. A great deal of land, including in Georgia, has no longer been occupied after Sherman's forces moved through it. And so there's a tendency of Confederate forces to flow back into areas through which the Union forces have passed. As a result of which, I think it's reasonable to say and which is why Confederate enlistment officers were sent into Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina and as well as Virginia and some points west. And so the fact that they produced next to nothing, I think, is also telling. However, your question does speak, once again, to the point of how late the Confederacy had waited and raises the interesting question, why? Thank you. Sir?
Is there any evidence about how lower class whites would have felt? Is there any evidence about how lower class whites would have felt about the early?
There is. This is one of the great things about studying the Civil War is that there are troves of letters to study. And then there are troves of letters not necessarily by the people involved, but by others talking about the people involved. And it's pretty clear, once again, it's the flip side of the answer to how the slaves felt. At the beginning of the war, they would have had none of it. Poor lower class whites would have had none of it because those who are in the Confederate Army firmly believe in white supremacy, firmly believe that slaves can't and shouldn't be allowed to bear arms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By the end of the war, there's a great deal of rethinking going on. At the very base level, better get this guy shot than get me shot. By the way, a sentiment that can be found in the Union Army as well. Sure, why should we kill off all the white men of the South and leave these people, and that's not the words they would have used, alive? Sure, push them all in. Even then, however, there's a vote taken. It's one of the, I think, the most fascinating moments in this story. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is besieged in Richmond and Petersburg. It is 11 o'clock on the clock of the Civil War. They are being pressed on all sides by Grant's forces. And nonetheless, at the request of the Secretary of Judah Benjamin, Secretary of State, Lee polls the regiments. The regiments are organized and presumably pulled away momentarily from the defenses, right? And they discuss this. This is how politicized a war this is, though. It's an amusing story, but it reminds us how white-hot the politics of this war are. The Army is a political instrument, not just a military one, and these regiments come together and argue and vote, and then the commanding officer records the votes and passes the information on to the Confederate government, and fortunately, since a large amount of documentation within the Confederate government's archives was seized, when Richmond was evacuated, we have these reports. And so we know that by then, and especially after Robert E. Lee endorses the idea, there is a majority vote in favor of doing what Lee wants to do. There's also clear indication from the best study of Lee's army in this period that a lot of soldiers, as soon as this measure is passed, begin to desert the army. Yes, 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 put him instead of me, bye, and he's out the door. So you make of all of this what you will about what this tells us about what the Southern whites are thinking about race, but we can simply, I think, clearly tell what they think about the future prospects of the Confederacy at this point. Thanks for the question.
Is there any sort of evidence of response from either Great Britain or France as to this policy, with Judah Benjamin corresponding with either of those two governments?
Early in the war, Benjamin is instructing his representatives, the government's representatives in Europe, to say that we don't have the power to emancipate slaves. Even if you want us to, and even if we were so inclined, that's not the structure of the Confederacy. This is a matter up to the states. Around the same time that Jefferson Davis is reconsidering his attitude about recruiting them, Davis is also sending different kind of signals to the ambassadors. Well, maybe we could, maybe we can. This information, however, doesn't get to Europe. It doesn't get to London and Paris until well into 1865. And as you who are studying the discussions taking place in the British cabinet know, they are very carefully following the military side of this war. And if Palmerston and so on has already decided by the end of '63 that there's not much chance of the Confederacy succeeding, or at least not no evidence that it is going to succeed, he's no fool, and by the beginning of 65, he knows the Confederacy is a gone goose, and basically says that to the emissaries. Too late. It's too late to change our people's opinions of the Confederacy, too late to negate their understanding of who's fighting for what, and the population in England is anti-slavery, and too late for you to win anyway, so thanks but no thanks. There's even talk back in the Confederacy of how about if we offer to become a protectorate of the British Empire, or semi-colony or something, and one of the newspapers says, at this point, no one would accept us even as a gift. So, they're no fools either. Other questions?
Join me in thanking Dr. Levine